Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 13, December 1931 to January 1932.
The United States government, spurred to drastic action by public clamor for a change in the conduct of the war, was not slow in taking to heart the lessons of the disaster to the Bonin expedition. Admiral Morrison, who had practically staked his reputation on the success of the enterprise, resigned his post as Chief of Naval Operations immediately definite news of its failure was made public. To succeed him, the choice of the Secretary of the Navy fell upon Admiral Lincoln B. Muller, an officer whose reputation for sagacity and sound judgment rendered it in the highest degree unlikely that he would advise the government to embark upon any undertaking which did not offer reasonable prospects of success. For the position of Assistant Chief of Naval Operations, left vacant by the resignation of Rear Admiral Hubbard, a popular selection was made in the person of Rear Admiral Joseph Harper, the former governor and commandant of Guam, who had only lately been promoted to flag rank. Before the war, he had been regarded as an authority on naval strategy, and by his skillful conduct of the defense of Guam, he was proved also to be the possessor of tactical abilities of no mean order. A man of strong personality, he exercised considerable influence over all with whom he came in contact, including his chief. Throughout the period of their association, these two fine officers worked together in perfect harmony, with results that proved them to be an absolutely ideal combination. In the campaign that followed, it may reasonably be concluded that Rear Admiral Harper supplied the driving force and most of the plans, which Admiral Muller tempered by his caution and farsightedness. As a further concession to public opinion, Admiral Dallinger was relieved of his command and given the less considered appointment of President of the Naval Examining and Retiring Boards. Hard though it may seem for a distinguished flag officer to be thus superseded as the result of a disaster which he had foreseen and done his best to avert, the government no doubt felt that it would be unwise to continue in his command one who had come to be regarded by the public as an unlucky admiral. Such things often happen in war, and it was in keeping with his character that Admiral Dallinger should have loyally accepted the verdict of his superiors without complaint or apparent dissatisfaction, unlike some instances known to history. His successor in the chief command of the United States fleet was Admiral Templeton, who, it will be remembered, had taken the scouting fleet from Hampton Roads to San Diego by way of the Straits of Magellan. Certain other changes were also made, but these were of less importance and need not be noticed here. One of the first matters to occupy the attention of the new Chief of Naval Operations and his assistant was the problem of attacking the enemy's seaborne commerce, pending the organization of a new expedition which had already been determined upon. To arrange for immediate interference with the Japanese trade in European waters was by no means an easy task, since all the modern cruisers in the U.S. Navy were in the Pacific, in which area, indeed, they were most needed as scouts for the battle fleet. But there were available several passenger vessels belonging to the United States lines, possessing qualities such as speed and fuel endurance, which made them suitable for conversion into auxiliary cruisers. These ships were the Leviathan, of nearly 60,000 tons gross and 23 knots speed, one of the two largest ships in the world; the George Washington, of 23,788 tons gross and 18 knots, and the Mount Vernon, 18,372 tons and 20 knots. There were also the 12 American-built steamers of 14,100 tons and 17 knots, named after various presidents. Some of these ships had already been utilized as transports for the Pacific, but 5 were available for use in the campaign against Japanese commerce. They were the President Cleveland, President Jefferson, President Madison, President Pierce, and President Taft. These 8 steamers were taken in hand for conversion at the Atlantic Navy yards as rapidly as possible. Their withdrawal from commercial service had the unavoidable effect of making a present to neutral interests, mainly British and German, of the whole of the American transatlantic passenger traffic. In the Pacific, the enemy's trade was also to be harassed. Two newly completed 10,000-ton cruisers, the Albany and Columbia, under the command of Captain Appleton of the former ship as senior officer, were ordered to operate against Japanese trade with Australia, using Tutuila as their principal base. They were also to search for and destroy any Japanese cruisers they might encounter in this direction, an order that was to prove particularly fruitful, as will in due course be seen. The activities of the Bureau of Construction and Repair were further increased, work being accelerated as much as possible on the ships already laid down, while additional units were ordered as follows: 6 cruisers of 12,000 tons with diesel engines, 50 destroyers of 1,500 tons, 4 aircraft carriers, 20 ocean-going submarines, 6 auxiliaries, supply ships, and tenders. To remedy the immediate deficiency in scouting vessels in the Pacific, a number of suitable merchant steamers on that side were armed for employment as auxiliary cruisers. We must now turn to the main plan of campaign, which had been devised by the Naval Operations Bureau in consultation with their military confreres. This, in effect, was an adaptation of certain of the features of 2 earlier schemes, and the secret of its ultimate success lay in the care with which these features were selected and modified. The 2 plans referred to, which had been prepared long before but had not found favor hitherto, may be briefly summed up as follows. A. An invasion of Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan proper, by an army to be assembled in Alaska, the landing to be covered by a fleet based on Dutch Harbor, whence the expedition would take its final departure. B. The seizure of the island of Ponape, in the eastern portion of the Caroline Group, held by Japan under the Versailles Mandate, and its conversion into an intermediate base from which either Guam or the Philippines or both could be threatened. There were inherent difficulties about both schemes, but more particularly the first, owing to weather conditions in the waters to be traversed between Alaska and Hokkaido. As a matter of fact, Plan A was never seriously entertained by the American naval and military authorities, but to cloak their real intentions, it was essential that the enemy should be deceived on this point. With the object of persuading the Japanese that Plan A was being followed, the most elaborate arrangements were made. Several thousands of men, including those who for one reason or another could not be treated as first-class troops, were transported to Puget Sound, a few going direct to Dutch Harbor, the chief Unalaskan port, while every expedient that the united ingenuity of naval and military experts could suggest was put into operation for the benefit of possible enemy observers. An appearance of secrecy was given to the proceedings by dispatching all transports from San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle under sealed orders, a practice which, once established, was found extremely useful when it was required to send troops and munitions to another quarter for the real expedition. For convoy purposes on the Alaskan route, it was found necessary to employ the older cruisers and destroyers, the latter being relieved of their coastal patrol work further south by armed yachts and other auxiliary craft. Dutch Harbor soon became a center of naval activity, and it was allowed to leak out for the benefit of enemy agents that the battleships Arkansas, Wyoming, Florida, and Utah were to be dispatched there at a later stage in the proceedings, where, anchored behind booms and minefields, they would add to the appearance of preparation for something big. Rumors were permitted to escape into suspected quarters of projected fleet movements in the direction of Dutch Harbor, and naturally the reported presence of 4 battleships was exaggerated until it was whispered that the greater part of the U.S. Navy had been concentrated there. Stringent orders were at the same time issued that all naval movements were to be kept secret, a measure that went far to convince enemy agents of the imminence of serious attack from the direction of Alaska. Japanese submarines which endeavored to reconnoiter Dutch Harbor were driven off by patrol ships and airplanes, of which a large number had been directed to guard against such attempts, without being able to learn anything definite. All this added to the uneasiness which began to be felt in Japanese official quarters, and although at first it was scarcely credited that the Americans would venture upon such a hazardous enterprise, the persistent reports of activity in Alaska, combined with remembrance of the previous daring attempt upon Port Lloyd, gradually encouraged a belief in the reality of an impending attack from the northeast. Well-planned strategy thus reaped its reward, and for as long a period as could possibly have been hoped, the enemy was kept in a state of apprehension of a blow from a direction entirely opposite to the actual zone of activity. In planning the real attack, some use was made of Plan B, which was not, however, adopted in its entirety. Rear Admiral Harper, whose knowledge of the various islands of the Pacific was extensive and peculiar, had carefully weighed the advantages and disadvantages of many of them as points d'appui, and strongly urged the rejection of Ponape in favor of Truk, also known as Hogolu. This small subgroup, which is also part of the Carolines, lies some 450 miles to the westward of Ponape, and although offering better facilities for harboring a large squadron, is less well known than Ponape, and therefore seldom visited by trading vessels. Its distance from Guam, 600 miles, and from the east coast of Mindanao, the nearest of the Philippines, about 1,700 miles, also rendered it preferable to Ponape. If, as was believed, it could be seized and firmly held for a sufficient length of time, its possession would go far towards repairing the situation created when Guam was lost. It was decided that the expedition sent against the island must be launched from Tutuila, the nearest American possession, where it was found possible to concentrate the necessary forces without arousing enemy suspicions. The troops were provided mainly from the garrison of Hawaii, the pick of whom were gradually withdrawn and secretly transferred to Tutuila, while it was allowed to leak out that their destination was Alaska. The place of these troops was taken by newer formations, for which Hawaii became the training ground until they, too, were required for active service. Recruiting had meanwhile been proceeding on both a voluntary and compulsory basis, volunteers being called for at the same time that powers were reserved to draft any additional numbers needed. The first call was for 250,000 recruits, and the response was so excellent that 1,000,000 men were examined at their own request at various enlistment bureaux throughout the states. Those selected reached a very high standard, both mentally and physically. Recruits considered fit only for garrison duty were drafted to special units, which were later sent to Alaska as part of the arrangements made for deceiving the enemy. In the meantime, Japan was not without her troubles. China, having found that it was possible to create friction between Japan and neutral interests over questions of contraband of war and kindred matters, lost no opportunity of doing so. She found her chance in connection with certain neutral concessions for raising minerals which Japan needed for the prosecution of the war. American interests were active in endeavoring to prevent the export of such products to Japan, mainly by means of contracts with the neutral concessionaires which bound them to deliver to other customers. Japan did not scruple to put pressure upon the Chinese government to exercise their option of commandeering supplies irrespective of concessionaires' engagements, a maneuver made possible by a clause in the sale contracts reserving the right of cancellation by the concessionaires in such event. But the government at Peking, weak though it might be, was expert in procrastination and evasion, and Japan feared the effect on neutral opinion if she proceeded to use force to compel compliance with her wishes. In these circumstances, Japan endeavored to gain her ends by a policy of mingled threats and bribery, but this had little effect, as American influence was at work behind the scenes, with a longer purse to back it. Recourse was then had to Li Pinghui, the nominal governor of Manchuria, who was for all practical purposes a vassal of Japan and had an old score to settle with the Chinese government. On the pretext that he was dissatisfied with the central government's methods in dealing with Manchurian external affairs, and ignoring the fact that Peking had no real voice in such matters since Japan had extended her influence over the country, Li Pinghui demanded the resignation of the premier, Hun Yingfu, and his cabinet, and the appointment of his own nominees to succeed them. On being met with a refusal, he set his armies in motion and was soon in occupation of a number of villages in the province of Pechili, beyond the Great Wall which divides Manchuria from China proper. His troops were not only more numerous than those of which Peking could dispose at this juncture, but were superior in arms and equipment, and had the advantage of having been drilled by Japanese instructors. Li's old opponent, General Wang Su, at this time was far away in the south of China, with the best of his troops, engaged in crushing an incipient revolution. Probably, therefore, the issue would have turned in favor of Li. But before any decisive action had been fought, news was received that a serious revolt had broken out in northern Manchuria, where influences from the Russian Far Eastern Republic had long been at work fomenting discontent. Stimulated by American gold, the spirit of resistance only needed the opportunity presented by the withdrawal of Li Pinghui's soldiery to become active. Arms, ammunition, and experienced leaders were imported from across the Amur, and in a very short time the whole of the northern province of Heilongjiang was in a blaze, which extended rapidly southward into Kirin. The garrisons which had been left in a few of the more important places, such as Harbin, Kirin, and Chisihar, were able to hold out, but the districts away from the railway were speedily overrun by the insurgent peasantry. Leaving to some future date the settlement of his quarrel with the government of Peking, Li Pinghui hastily returned with the bulk of his troops to Mukden, there to concert measures with his Japanese advisors for dealing with the rebels who so seriously threatened his rule. For the second time, Japan's plans had miscarried, and she was now forced to content herself with the influence she was able to bring to bear upon the local governors of such provinces as Shantung, Hubei, and Yunnan, where were situated the principal sources of supply for iron, petroleum, and copper. Though this method was expensive and less satisfactory than dealing with the central government, it was found to answer sufficiently well for the moment, insofar as it ensured that the Japanese shipbuilding and munition programs would not be held up by lack of raw materials. In connection with the transport of petroleum from Hankow to Japan, there were few difficulties, as the river Yangtze offered an excellent channel of communication. But one incident occurred which is worth recounting. Both the United States and Japan had for many years maintained gunboats on the Yangtze for police purposes and to protect their commercial interests, nor had the outbreak of war affected the position on this neutral waterway beyond causing each side to keep a watchful eye upon the other. But the apprehensions of a Japanese merchant captain now caused an explosion which was with difficulty localized. On December 29, 1931, the Japanese oil tanker Udachi Maru had just left Hankow with a full cargo when she noticed that the U.S. gunboat Pallas was some distance astern, apparently in pursuit, though as a matter of fact her movements were afterwards proved to have no reference to those of the oil tanker. No doubt the Japanese captain had been misled by imaginative stories circulating in Hankow as to the steps which the Americans were prepared to take to interfere with the traffic in which he was engaged. At any rate, he imagined himself to be chased, and having armed his crew with rifles which were carried as a protection against Chinese pirates, he actually ordered them to fire upon the Palos. The bullets were mostly wide or short of the mark, but one or two hit the hull of the Pallas. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander O'Halloran, was naturally indignant at this unprovoked attack, and fired a warning shell over the Udachi Maru, which in the meantime had increased speed to the utmost. Probably the affair would have ended more or less tamely had not the Japanese gunboat Fushimi, which was lying off the town of Wusua, taken in the frantic radio appeals for help which the Udachi Maru was broadcasting, and hastened up river under a full head of steam. Arriving just as the Palos had fired, the situation appeared clear, and the Fushimi answered the shot without hesitation. Thus protected, the Udachi Maru speedily quitted the scene, leaving the two gunboats to fight it out. They were not unequally matched. Both carried identical armaments, namely 2 6-pounder guns, and neither could steam at much over 13 knots. The Palos displaced 190 tons, just 10 tons more than the Fushimi, and each carried a crew of about 50. Neither ship had any armor protection, and as the range was short, casualties soon began to occur. The Palos was getting somewhat the better of it, having set the Fushimi on fire, when a newcomer intervened, again in response to the signals of the Udachi Maru. This was the Japanese gunboat Hodzu of 340 tons, built in 1928 and armed with two 12-pounders. Fearing he would soon be overmatched and determined to settle with at least one of his opponents, Lieutenant Commander O'Halloran closed with the Fushimi, keeping her between him and the Hodzu. Owing to the smoke in which she was enveloped and their preoccupation in fighting the flames, the Fushimi's people made no attempt to avoid the Pallas, which rammed her amidships and opened a large rent in her hull. As the U.S. gunboat backed away, she came under a severe fire from the guns of the Hodzu, a shell from which killed the gallant O'Halloran. Finding the ship was leaking badly in the bows, which had been crumpled by the impact, the warrant officer who was now left in charge of the Pallas beached her at a convenient spot just above Wusua, leaving to the Hodzu the task of rescuing the crew of the sinking Fushimi. The Pallas herself was a complete wreck, the whole of her upper works being shattered, while less than 20 men were left on their feet. The local Chinese authorities, making no secret of their hostility towards the Japanese, were prompt in rendering assistance to the survivors, who received every care and attention, while an armed guard of Chinese soldiers was placed over the wrecked American gunboat. But for this, she would probably have been taken possession of by the Japanese, who were much incensed at the loss of the Fushimi and were with difficulty deterred from attacking the Chinese sentries. After some days of angry correspondence through the usual diplomatic channels, the Chinese persuaded both sides to submit the dispute to the British Consul General at Hankow. His investigations showed clearly that the whole affair arose through the baseless misgivings of the master of the Udachi Maru, who in consequence found himself rather unpopular in Japanese official circles, though the chauvinistic section of the public were disposed to regard him as a hero. To avoid a repetition of such incidents, it was arranged that the contending powers should keep the British consular representatives advised of all intended movements of their gunboats on Chinese rivers, so that each might be informed through neutral channels of the whereabouts of the other, and so avoid unexpected encounters.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.